Hello, everyone, and welcome to One Control 4 Podcast, episode 343. My name is Benjamin Yoder. I'm here today to talk to you about how the gaming industry is dead. It's on fire. It's over. There's been a lot of kind of weird news stories in the game industry as of late. And, you know, I've been talking about these things kind of piecemeal. And I thought it might be good to just kind of like talk about these things as one larger topic. So that's going to be probably the majority of today's show. I'm not going to talk about any games I've been playing, unfortunately. I'm going to take some more time with the games that I'm playing before I talk about them too in depth. But in addition, we'll also be getting into everybody's favorite topic. Everyone, you already, if you listen to the podcast, you already know where we're going with this. There's a new NFT game platform launching. To one of the guys who worked on like Monster Strike, and I thought some of the language around this platform was kind of interesting. Again, not particularly supporting NFT gaming myself personally, but I still think it's interesting to kind of look at what's going on there. And then also there's a machine translation thing going on as well with, they had it at the Tokyo Indie Game Summit, some companies talking about trying to make machine translations more game and dialogue friendly and things like that. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but probably late in the show for that case. So, but to get on it, yeah, I mean, so unless you don't really keep up with games, I don't know like how visible this is if you aren't, you know, chronically on Twitter or something like that. You know, there's been a lot of layoffs in the game industry lately. I think I saw a statistic that was basically like, hey, within the last like 2 months, there's been more layoffs in this time period than all of last year, right? And I think number one, you know, the thing I think we should all keep in mind is that like the real tragedy of this is you know, people losing their job. Who knows at what point in their life they're at, you know, what kind of financial situation they're in, all that stuff. You know, that is really the big tragedy of this. And, you know, all of us gossiping online, I think in a lot of ways isn't really considered to those people very often. But, you know, we're not, you know, people who are engaged in the ability to talk about like what actions do, you know, individuals need to take, or what actions need to be taken on the government level or things like that to, you know, protect people in these situations, make sure they get the adequate care they need when they get laid off and all that stuff. Right. So, I'm not capable of talking to that, and I'm gonna guess, you know, Mr. Retro John 27 on YouTube also is completely incapable of talking about that unless he used to have some crazy background that added to that conversation. So, anyways, but yeah, so there's been all these layoffs, and it looks really bad. You know, a lot of this stuff probably comes out of the fact that like in 2020 there was a big rush on the game industry. There's a lot of money coming in because of everybody being like, you know, locked at home and stuff like that, right? And then you had a lot of upscaling of the industry and upscaling of employment, a lot of purchase and buyouts, lots of money, you know, that was going around and stuff like that, and a lot of projects that got kickstarted, or not kickstarted in the Kickstarter sense, but, you know, kicked off, things like that. And then now we're kind of seeing that like, oh, now that people have the ability to choose between multiple entertainment mediums again, that are not just in the house, you know, things are kind of falling back apart. It seems to be kind of how this whole thing's kind of playing out. So, but I think the reason why this is getting so much attention is because of like how many other things are happening all at once right now, right? So you have, you know, basically this idea that AAA games are becoming, you know, too big. You have, you know, this whole thing with like live service games kind of continuing to be difficult to launch and all that stuff. There's a lot of factors, I think, adding up to this. And ultimately what people, I think, the buzzword going around the first day, well, not even the first day, the buzzword going around in some cases, or at least on my feed, was, you know, video game crash happening. If you don't know, 1983, 1982, I don't remember, 1980s, I believe. I don't remember. Old video game time. There's a video game crash in the U.S. specifically where a lot of companies, you know, were no longer, you know, profitable in the gaming space, I believe, including Atari. I'm saying this all based off like things I've learned over the years from this topic. And if there's one thing we know about video game history telling, especially over the course of the 2000s and things like that, and narratives established back then, they're not necessarily true. So don't take this as 100% fact. But, you know, it was a very different time in the industry. And I think the reality is that people using that term, pointing to that era, probably are less saying like, hey, this is going to be a similar crash, as much as they're talking about like, you know, they think, you know, gaming revenue is going to drop significantly and player bases are going to drop and stuff like that. I don't really know what their idea is of like what will come out of this, honestly, if it was like a video game crash. But at the end of the day, the video game industry as a whole has been very healthy, right? I was looking at a 1970 to 2022 global gaming revenue chart. I believe it was, let me see who it was. I didn't like scrutinize this data. Keep in mind that with this podcast is very slapdash. But it was from visualcapitalist.com, and they pulled some resources from source Pellman Smithers. I don't know what that is. But that's basically, it seems like they pulled some resources there. Video game revenue has been significantly growing for years and years and years now, right? I don't think they have 2023 or 2024 mapped out at this point on this graph. I'm sure you could if you really wanted to. But basically the gaming console market has floated around like 25 to 30 billion for the last like 10 years, and then mobile has basically gone like kind of exploded from, I believe it's 40 billion in 2015 to 100 billion in 2022 essentially. So pretty significant scale of the market. So like a significant drop of revenue would have to happen for video games to like go away in any meaning, like in the way that I think in the US we perceived video games going away during like the gaming console crash. I don't think that's really what people are talking about here. I think really people are just talking about their kind of discontent wrapped up with a lot of things in the industry and things like that. And I think one of the things that I've been seeing recently is where you see kind of people saying, look at how all these Western companies are failing. And they're saying, but look at Japan. Japan has raises for these employees, all that stuff. I think missing the point that, like, I believe to my understanding is that in Japan, laying people off, not particularly an easy task. You can do it, but and I think like Sony laid people off in Japan, I believe. But like what they do is they're not necessarily laying them off right now. They get like moved into like a career program essentially. I assume because the government requires that, right? So they have like I think it's called like next generation career or something like that. It was some literally English word that they like convert into katakana, and like as far as I can tell, next career program maybe. But in katakana, if you go look it up, like a bunch of companies use this. Have been using it forever. There's I found like some old like I think it was like Oracle in 2003, like enrolling people in this program in their company and stuff. So it's a term, and there's like companies that seem specialized in helping other companies kind of, help employees get to other employment areas or other companies that they can get employed. Don't know how effective it is or anything like that. So there's just like a program there. And so like you don't get like a specific like immediate laid off number with them kind of thing. But I think as far as I understand, it's like laying off people is a lot harder. So I think when you look at like, okay, how is the West doing versus Japan? I think more you need to look at like revenue and profits and things like that. And, I didn't do like a formal, review of this stuff and like compare them side by side. But the general gist I seem to see is that like, it seems like the range of profitable companies versus unprofitable ones seems pretty balanced between the U.S. and Japan in terms of, when just looking at their revenue and things like that and what they've been saying profit-wise. I think it more depends on just like, did they have a hit game and stuff like that, right? Bandai Namco also like had the significant, downside of, compared to last year when they had Elden Ring not really having anything like that. Meanwhile, Armored Core did very well, but it's no Elden Ring, right? Or however long that tail was for Elden Ring and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things that I think the regional narrative is more painted by the fact that, you're going to see layoffs in U.S. companies significantly more than other companies in other regions and things like that. So it's one of those things that I think a lot of this is driven by, people having particular feelings about the industry and where it's gone. One example of this, I wonder, should I say their name? I don't know. I don't know if it's really a problem. I'm going to say their name because I don't really have a criticism against them. There's a Twitter account called The Emotion Engine. Mr. Wads is what the URL says or whatever. But they're talking about Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist of Rose. Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist of Rose is I believe a PS2 game, if I remember correctly, that sold like 1,000 copies. I don't know what region that is. They did not really provide any information. It was a very off the cuff post, so I do not really expect that. But they were kind of talking about the fact that, one of the things they loved about, essentially 20 years ago in the industry is that companies released so many games. And so they basically kind of divided up risk between all these different projects and things like that. And so if a game like Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist of Rose came out and did not succeed, they had like 22, 23 other games they could rely on, basically. And, they basically talked about how they wished more companies took this approach today, and they think that it would basically help kind of stymie off this kind of thing, I think, to some extent. That was the impression I was getting from their tweet they did. And I reached out to them a little bit and just was like, hey, can you elaborate a little bit more on this? Because I was kind of curious, what would they prefer to see and things like that, right? And there's some other people that got in the conversation, and it kind of went into the typical game companies are greedy and they want big money versus little money now, stuff like that. Which is true to some extent, right? Again, big companies do need big income kind of thing. And the hard part of that is, making sure it's profitable, right? I mean, that's kind of the thing with Sony, is that Sony has really good revenue right now. But the profits they're making is not as good. And it's one of those things that kind of came up, and it's we were talking about a couple of weeks ago about how Konami is portrayed by people. Konami's oh, these guys screwed it up. These guys messed it up, right? These guys dropped the ball on the market, and they're just gone, right? And I actually did a little reach out and got people's feelings on Konami, because I was kind of curious. And people seem to be a little bit more positive on their retro re-releases and things like that, but maybe not so involved in their kind of modern output, right? And we talked about this. They were the third best-selling physical software seller in Japan in last year, basically, right? They also have incredibly successful mobile games with Baseball Spirits and the Yu-Gi-Oh game, Yu-Gi-Oh! Masters of Duel, I believe, or Dueling Masters, one of those two, Master Duel. And I went back and looked at Konami's revenue and things like that. And yes, if you look at Konami's revenue alone, it spiked super high with Metal Gear Solid 5. That is when they had their highest revenue in, as far as I could tell, whatever range it was. I forget how many years, but the last, let's say 2 decades. I don't know if that's exact, but that was in my mind how it looked. The last 2 to 3 decades, how much revenue they had. But when you look at profits, it actually wasn't very good. So they had all this money coming in, but the costs of these games were significantly more expensive. So when you look at what they're doing today, focusing on arcade releases, focusing on retro games, and then, it should be mentioned, they have, gambling stuff. They have a lot of things that are not just video games, but video games still remain a chunk of their business. They seem to be doing significantly better today. They make significantly more profit today. And so, when people are looking at Konami getting out of the Metal Gear Solid 5 space, or the AAA gaming space, and blaming them on that, I think today, I feel like we're looking at a company that made the right choice, right? The company that figured out what they needed to do to get them in a position where they could, be as profitable as possible without investing ridiculous amounts of money into these giant games, right? And I think a lot of us today want that out of the industry, right? We want these games to be made at, smaller scales, smaller budgets. And, maybe I shouldn't say a lot of us, people talking on Twitter, people who are gaming commentators in general, I feel like, as well, just in this space that I have lived my life. And it is something that I think is actually, Konami actually, I think, fits pretty well what we want to do today. But I think the problem is that when you see that in the modern lens, you see all the negative sides of it at the same time, right? Konami doing an NFT game, Konami selling Castlevania NFTs, them doing the Metal Gear Solid collection that didn't have the greatest port job, but people seem to still buy it anyways, right? And so I think people will kind of like idolize these older periods in their history without realizing that, like, along with that, there were a lot of bad things happening at the same time, right? I think that's just the case, that things are always happening with the industry, right? It's the thing I always talk about where, like, when I came out of the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube era, I was really critical of 360 and PS3 games because, like, these games are incredibly market tested feeling. These games are incredibly, more and more focused on polish and stuff like that. And I'm like, PS3 and 360 are just platforms that are not for me. And if I look at it today, I don't think that's actually true. But, I think when we see the games that are being promoted as the big games every year, that's just the general feeling, where there are mind jacks happening if in the corners of the market without you realizing it. But yeah, and so I felt that way. And then I saw people 10 years later being like, oh man, I really miss the PS3 and 360 era with the creativity that platform had versus PS4 and Xbox One. It felt like basically looking at myself 10 years ago and being like, oh, this is you saying that again. Where I think today we have like one of the most, diverse times in gaming with all the different delivery platforms we have, all the different types of games we have, all the different like scales of games you have, AAA, crazy high budget stuff. And then also you have, the thing that was made with like Unity assets and stuff, but could still be kind of cool if you really sit down and think about it, right? Like if somebody put something cool together in Unity assets, it's still kind of cool, right? And so I think it's just one of those things that, like, it's really hard to, in the moment, tell what is the thing that defines this particular era in gaming. And especially when you had this previous era from gaming 10 years ago that really built the values that you had as a player, and you want to see more of those kind of come through and things like that. And I think it's like one of those really challenging things where people are going to kind of selectively choose to look at what they want to in past generations, without necessarily, giving that same consideration to the modern day. Because I think the thing I always like think about is like with Square Enix, there's a lot of complaints about where Square Enix is going now, where they're saying we're going to invest more in AAA. And, this is right alongside Final Fantasy VII Rebirth coming out and being really well received. So I think people generally feel good about that. But you have people looking at the producer for Harvestella, right? That little, kind of farming RPG game that people really liked at the time when it came out, but I believe financially didn't do so great. And saying like, oh, these games are going away, but then they like at the same time, and maybe I shouldn't say they because who they are is very broad, right? But when I think of like, how Balan Wonderworld was received, how Valkyria Elysium was received. And so it becomes this thing where like we hyper focus on the benefits of a game like Harvestella, but then we fail to recognize that a game like Harvestella also produces games like Balan Wonderworld and Valkyria Elysium, right? And so I think people really get kind of caught up in this whole thing. So I know this is kind of just rambling, but I think at the end of the day, I think it's one of those things where change is always scary in the game industry, especially as you get older and you want more and more things to be representative of what you love about games, right? And there's just kind of this weird feeling when you have people who make love letters to old games where like they don't feel like they represent the energy of that older game, right? Like if somebody makes a Chrono Trigger love letter game, it kind of feels like a love letter to Chrono Trigger. It doesn't feel like a game like Chrono Trigger, right? And so I don't really know what causes that to happen and why games feel that way. It's just, and that may be an internal thing, right? Where it is very like, hey, Chrono Trigger defined how I view these types of games at this time. So if you give me a game that looks and feels like Chrono Trigger today, I'm going to look at that through the lens of Chrono Trigger rather than as its own standalone thing. But I do feel like that for me personally, there's definitely things where like, another Code R coming out and being like, I don't really need this, right? Endless Ocean coming out and being like, I don't really need this because they feel like they are more of coming to scratch an itch that I have rather than try to, create something that will impress me in the way the original games ever did, right? That they'll exceed my expectations beyond that, right? I'm not saying that's always the case. I always talk about, Bloodstained Curse of the Moon. What an amazing game that is. And it really is both a great love letter and a great video game. And it does a lot of amazing things from an Any Creates perspective, from a Castlevania perspective. Like, I don't know if any game does that nearly as well as any other, if any game has done that in the way that I think Curse of the Moon did that for me. But yeah. And I think one of the things that I maybe the overall point of this is that, like, I don't necessarily think, what's happening in the industry, again, people losing their job sucks. That's a whole other thing. But I don't necessarily think what's happening in the industry is necessarily a bad thing right now. Again, people losing their jobs suck. But the bigger thing is, I think when you look at it from a consumer perspective, right? When you look at it from that perspective, I think there are a lot of really interesting things out there right now to explore. And, AAA games are definitely still around, and still, I think there's still really interesting stuff coming out. I do think there's probably needs to be a change in the AAA game space, right? Sony, having that recent investor call where they basically had to say, we have to really rethink how we're spending our money. I'm really curious to see how that might impact the games they make, right? But I think it's one of those hard things where these budgets are ballooning so much, but at the same time, you have so many other tools, and, like, what is it called, the democratization of game making and stuff like that, right? There's so many tools out there for you to make, like, really, really good and impressive and unique games, right? That, like, I really can't feel too hard about AAA budgets and stuff. But, I think AAA, has its place, though, right? You really want a game to really blow your socks off sometimes with its presentation, right? You want a game that is this technical marvel in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of people who kind of live for that when it comes to gaming, right? And I don't want to, like, downplay their interest there. But I think that kind of thing probably will still exist, but will probably get narrower and narrower in the types of games that succeed in that space, right? So anyways, all that's just to say is that, like, I think my hope overall is that people don't come to dislike the industry for what it is today, right? I think I feel really bad about this. And if you're a Sega fan, I feel really bad about saying this, but this is just a reality of how I felt growing up, where I was around 10 when the Dreamcast came out and stuff, and there's a lot of bad feelings about the Dreamcast over the years, in terms of just people feeling like, Sega messed it up, all these things were just, like, going against the Dreamcast, right? And I really felt like around the time I was going 15, 16, 17, this weird, like, rejection of modern games from people who are in the Sega audience, right? And this feeling that, like, oh, they can't move on from the games they're playing on these older platforms. And like, I think it's a little sad that they're just, like, stuck there, right? And that doesn't, like, hey, look, that's super exciting, though. I love Wii games. Like, I can play Wii games all goddamn day, right? And I have a great time with them. And so, like, I definitely could be that as well. But I do think there is always the fear that, like, you kind of pigeonhole yourself in this one space with one set of values specifically, and you're kind of unwilling to, like, look around to the rest of the gaming industry and find what could be interesting to you, right? And I think, unfortunately, one of the problems with a lot of the modern games is with the demonization of live service games, is that there's a large part of the market that people just aren't willing to look at, right? There's a lot of really interesting stuff coming out on mobile, and unfortunately, a lot of it dies very quickly, right? And it kind of sucks, but yeah, it's one of those things. Anyways, I've been rambling for a long time about this, but I just hope if you are feeling down about the industry, just, at least from a consumer perspective, realize there's just a lot of stuff out there, and there's a lot of things out there for you to find and be interested in, I think. And I think the big thing is kind of like with anything, you just got to kind of go out there and look for it. And sometimes that means, buying and playing a game that you might not love, right? But if you keep looking, I think you will find something. And I think it's good to make educated, purchases on, what you like and stuff like that, right? Try to find things that catch your attention. Don't stress too much about, every little detail of what that game is, right? Or like if it has microtransactions or not. Unless you, obviously, if you're vulnerable to like things like microtransactions, that's a very different story, right? But yeah, I just think, there's a good space in the industry today to continue to explore. And I think that's one of the things I really love is that, it is a space that's only getting bigger, and it makes it harder and harder to find cool things. And the discoverability is a problem, right? And especially from a developer side of things, it's a real problem. But from a consumer side of things, I think there's a lot of value in the industry today. And I don't think, what's happening in the AAA market, what's happening in the live service game market, A, I don't think they're going to go away, but B, I don't think it's going to really affect your ability to go out there and find the games that you really want, if you really care, to find them. So anyways, that's it for that. Hopefully that made some sense. I don't know. I felt like at some point I just was kind of rambling. I had notes, but I did not follow them at all. So I used them to pull out some specific facts here. And that was about it. Hey, it's time for Jillian's Corner. We're down to like the last 4 questions, I think, from Jillian. So thank you again this week for Ko-fi donations from Mega Mint and Demodori. Thank you again to both of you for being supporters this week. Again, if you want to ask questions, feel free to do so. I'd be happy to answer them. But in the meantime, Jillian asks a question. Jillian says, have you read any Iwata Asks? And I did read Iwata Asks. Heck, if I can remember any part of what was in there. I remember one of them had like a Frisbee controller with a star on it. And I think the Wii U one had like a tablet with 2 remotes connected to the side of it. I remember those things. That's about it. No, I mean, one of the things that probably like I remember most is that, so when you're in, I don't know, maybe it depends on the school you're in. When you're in high school or middle school here, when I was in Georgia specifically, and then also Las Vegas, he had like reading time for some reason. I don't really know why that existed as a thing other than just, I know why is they wanted to get people to read more, kids to read more. But most of the time, just sitting there and, reading a book or something, right? However, Iwata Asks hit the scene. I believe that, I'm hoping I'm remembering this correctly, but I believe I remember Iwata Asks coming out when I was in high school. And I remember going and printing off a bunch of the published ones at the time. And I think it was a fairly new thing. And reading those in class, and a teacher getting very confused while I was reading these interviews. And I think eventually I was told I couldn't read them anymore. They want me to read a book. But I did print out those Iwata Asks on printer paper and brought them into class to read them. So there's my Iwata Asks memory. I don't know if I have a lot more depth to talk about the Iwata Asks with that. Do miss me in a Mr. Satoru Iwata. But we'll see. We'll see. Like he's gonna come back. I guess that's that. That is that. Thank you again for donating. Thank you again, Jillian, for your question. As we go towards the end, sunsetting Jillian's Corner. We got two last topics for this week's show. One is for NFTs, everybody's favorite. There is a new NFT platform launched by a fellow who had worked on the Monster Strike series. If you don't know, a very popular mobile game for a long time. I don't think it's as relevant today, but it's one of those things that, like, who knows? Maybe it's huge in Japan. I just don't know. But he's making a company called Kusogeeeee. Which, if you don't know, Kusogeeeee is basically like bad game, shit game, something like that. But yeah, it's Kusog, and then a bunch of E's afterwards. But yeah, it was an interesting interview when he was talking, or it was more like a presentation, I think, that he was talking about it, where it was basically him talking about what he viewed as, so he recognized that, like, hey, blockchain's in a rough spot right now. And also, he also recognized that games in the kind of NFT blockchain place hasn't really taken off. And his theory as to why is that it is too complicated to get into, which, if you don't know, blockchain games are a nightmare to get into. You usually have to have like a wallet and then get on a chain and then buy a currency. There's a bunch of like steps, and like none of them, like every step of the way is like this weird, scary thing where like it feels like everything could just blow up at any moment. Especially if you don't know what you're doing. But anyways, so it is, so what he's trying to do here is basically make a platform that is significantly more user-friendly. So what he's doing, he's creating a game platform where you can basically use his platform as a way to basically just do direct purchases of NFTs and things like that using yen, right? So you're basically in the same way on a PlayStation store, you'd go buy DLC for a game. You could just go buy, NFTs within the Kusogeeeee space. And basically he has one game on that platform right now. I don't know if it's out yet, but the one game is called, I think it's called like Changoku Shi One-chan Sangoku Kushi, which is a Three Kingdoms anime girl game. But it has actual drawn art, which for a lot of NFT games these days usually will rely on AI art. So it's nice to see some nice clean art. But I believe the characters are not actually the NFTs in this case. And I believe from what I could tell, the weapons are the NFTs. But it seems to be kind of focused around more small scale trading, small scale profits and things like that. And, I don't really know if this is any different than, like, say, what Line is doing, right? But I thought it was interesting that this is, like, his communication, the way he's communicating about this platform is to basically say that, like, hey, all these platforms are way too confusing, way too scary, so this is how we think we can get people in. And they've really emphasized that Changoku Kushi is a auto RPG. Which, if you've been following our NFT chronicles of games, you'll know that is the common NFT thing. And I've kind of downplayed that in the past, and I feel kind of guilty about it. And I think especially as I pay a little bit more attention to like what's going on in mobile RPGs and things like that, auto RPGs probably are more commonplace than you'd expect. At least in how people interact with games. I always talk about how, like, every time I see anyone playing Honkai Star Rail, it's, like, in fast forward, and they're, like, not doing anything. I know there's more to that game than that, but that is, like, how I feel like every Honkai Star Rail experience I've had has been so far. And so, like, it is one of those things that, like, I think it is one of the things when you look at it from a traditional gaming perspective, you can look at it and be like, this is like an actual RPG. But, mobile games do this a lot. So, maybe not that weird. That's not to say it's a good one of those, just that maybe I have overplayed that aspect of it in general. But it was kind of funny that he was like, his motivation for starting this this page was that he has not made enough money through blockchain, and he would like to make money through blockchain, basically. Said it in a very jokingly way, as far as I can tell. Again, using machine translation for all these things. So anyways, there's that. The games themselves don't look particularly remarkable, though. So the game itself. There's another NFT game that got announced recently I looked at as well that also was not remarkable looking. So they're still coming. Still coming, baby. We'll see when they stop. If they stop. Who can say? He believes that it is a new frontier in the market, and that he doesn't want it to die with the recent setbacks, as he says. One other thing that might ruffle some feathers if you're, not really into this kind of stuff is at the Tokyo Indie Summit, there was Digital Hearts was there, and they're a company that is basically involved with debugging and localization. They recently partnered with Rosetta, who's like an AI translation company. And, I don't really know at Tokyo Indie Summit what kind of scale games we're looking at here, honestly. Maybe that's something I should have looked into, because when I think Tokyo Indie Summit, right? Sorry, I'm clicking around, so you might hear some clicking. When I think Tokyo Indie Summit, right, I'm thinking like Dojin-looking video games, right? Has this event actually happened yet? I think, yes, it has happened. I don't know what games were. Oh, here we go. Titles. Got Little Cheese Works, Pearly Nightmare. I think that's like I forget who that is. I played that at PAX. Belgor, The Devil Within, Forgotten Fragments. So these games look like Stray is there. Okay. So Needy Girl Overdose. Okay. So these are actual companies here. This is not like Dojin. I mean, some of these are like nearing Dojin levels. Maybe there's different scales. There's one that's like, this might be, okay. I think this is like Dojin and bigger scale release. Stray being on this list is questionable, but they're listed as a sponsor. So maybe that's the whole thing. But there's definitely like Physical Layer. I remember seeing that. That's like very Dojin game looking thing. So anyways, all kinds of indie, who knows what indie is. But at the end of the day, it is really hard for indie developers to get their games translated effectively. And especially at the smaller scale, what you usually see with indie developers is they'll just run their games through machine translation for the English release, which, is nicer than having to use like a camera translation tool. Absolutely, for sure. Having the direct text at least being run through an auto translator later, if you don't know any Japanese, is helpful at the very least. What they're trying to kind of push with this particular tool they're doing is trying to make machine translation that is better fit for storytelling in games. So when you are translating character dialogue through machine translation, it's not taking a very literal approach to the words. It sounds like you can basically like define certain aspects and personality and traits about a character, and it will take that consideration when trying to select words and things like that for a character. And it tries to also do that for like jokes and things like that. So it seems like be like a mix of like maybe like a Chat GPT plus auto translation kind of thing of like, hey, here's some defining characteristics about this thing, and then also, respond to this, using dialogue that's going to be a little bit more friendly in this language if this character is a more friendly character kind of thing. So, and, when you look at, game translations on a corporate scale, on a larger scale, I think that's where things get kind of weird with that stuff, because at that point it's like, okay, taking jobs kind of thing. And then, you have to start asking like, okay, well, what's the responsibility of companies and government in that whole process kind of thing. But when it comes to like people doing Dojin games, right? I mean, kind of the thing about Dojin stuff is they're independent, individual people, and they're not making money really. So like they're not gonna be able to hire translators to translate this stuff really. And if they do, there's a very good chance it will not particularly succeed, right? I think of the Scum of the Brave. I feel a little bad because I wonder if she did the translation because I was so interested in Scum of the Brave. But it just bombed super hard in English speaking world. Yeah, like those people, like if they're not going to do it, then at the very least they can, have these kind of modifiers to add these modifiers to machine translation to try to create a better experience for somebody kind of thing, right? So anyways, I thought it was interesting. And when you think about Dojin games in particular, I think it could be a pretty handy tool, but I don't know, like, how much this company's like services cost, right? Is this even within reach of a Dojin game company, or are they really trying to aim at the Strays of the world? Machine translate your cat into Japanese. Anyways, that's it for this week. Thanks for coming. OneControlWar.com is the website. So I lied last time. The Crazy Climber video did not come out last week. It was the Barbie and the Three Musketeers podcast highlight. And then also it uploaded the audio issues again, like the Saz gambling video did as well. So sorry about that. I went back and made sure everything was fixed. I know why it happened, and I fixed the issue that caused that. I just did not realize the Barbie video had that issue happen in it. So that's up. Again, podcast clip as before, but with some gameplay attached to it. So if you didn't listen to that Barbie and Three Musketeers podcast clip back in like October last year, there you go. There's a place you can do it. Cut down, slightly refined, and with gameplay. So anyways, that's gonna be it for this week, though. Thanks for coming. I guess that's gonna be that's all I really have. I've been working on some stuff. Nothing's anywhere really near close to being done, unfortunately. So maybe something will happen eventually, but at the moment, not a lot going on that I can share with you. But hopefully in the near future, that will be the case. So anyways, hope you guys have a great week. Bye.